Hey, welcome back. All right, we're going to continue our little mini series on incident response. We're on to part three of the series and step two of the SANS incident response cycle. So, we're going to be talking about identification, right? As we go through this, in the last video, we talked about preparation, and preparation is just the training, getting ready for an incident, really trying to understand what your internal process is going to be, who's engaged, what is the process, what does it look like, things like that. Identification is really about determining if this is actually an incident, right? So, when we talk about identification, what we really mean is what are we looking at? What's the impact of it? And where do we kind of go from here? So, it usually starts by reviewing alarms or whatever the reported activity was, right? So, an incident can be kicked off by any number of things. Ideally, it's kicked off by your tools, right? Hopefully, you're in a situation where your internal tooling and your detection capability are on par, and you're notified or your SOC is notified that something mischievous is happening, and you're able to take it from there. In those situations, you could be looking at the alarm and determining, okay, is this a true or false positive? If it's true positive, it means that the bad thing that the alarm was looking for was found, whether it be malicious software being launched on a workstation, whether it's a rogue login from some third, from a country that a person shouldn't be in. But there's also non-alarm based activity, maybe. So maybe an employee just reports to the SOC that they started getting MFA authentication requests on their device, and their token is prompting them to say yes, but they're not trying to log in anywhere, right? That's a signal that somewhere a correct credential is being entered and now hitting an MFA prompt. So that in itself is a signal that something could be going on. So it's not just alarms, but pretty often, if things are going well in your environment and you have the right tooling, it's going to be an alarm that triggers this kind of event. Now, once you determine that something bad did happen, the identification steps are starting the IR process, right? That might be setting up a bridge for people to join. It might be getting an incident commander assigned. It might be notifying the rest of your IR team. If you have a dedicated IR team, that's awesome. Most organizations don't. So, really, it's just kind of wrangling the people you need engaged, your SIM engineers, your SOC engineers, kind of like we talked about last time. It's notifying whoever in the organization needs to be notified. Could be a director of cybersecurity. It could be a CISO. It could be, the president of the company if it's a big enough organization and a big enough risk. And then scoping really starts under the identification step. You want to know what's impacted, what's happening, where it's happening, and what's at risk. And crucially, you need to start documenting what's going on. Documentation is critical during an incident for a lot of reasons. You need to be able to communicate effectively across the group and catch people up as you loop more and more people in. You need to understand what the facts of the situation are, and that can't really be done without documentation. And you really need to understand where everyone is engaged and what everyone is sort of doing. And without good documentation, you can't do that. From a legal perspective, you also probably need documentation on the line in the event you're in a position where you need to do some type of public notification or customer notification, or if there's a breach or loss of data, you need to be able to prove what happened, when it happened, where it happened, and why you acted the way you did to make sure you weren't being negligent or anything like that. But scoping is the bulk of the work here. And scoping is both cyclical and kind of tedious, right? You'll hear terms like spreadsheet of doom used when we start talking about scoping an incident. And it's because scoping is hard, takes time, and you don't really know when it's going to end until it's over. And for a lot of organizations, it's really frustrating. Now, the reason scoping gets kind of rough is because we go through this cycle where we look for indicators of compromise, right? We might find something on a device, right? We'll say, okay, we're going to look at this device because this is where the first alarm originated from. We saw a weird malicious piece of software execute. So that is our first indicator of compromise. There's a weird piece of software executing. Now we start digging in there and we say, okay, we found this piece of software. Is it installed anywhere else? So we start searching all of our devices for that weird piece of software, right? We start going through our EDR logs, we start looking around, and we say, yep, we found this in a bunch of other devices. So now let's go look at the other device and see what's there and make sure there's nothing new. And when we start that investigation, we might find that in addition to this malicious piece of software, we also found a file transfer tool that we don't really know what it is. So now we need to look for that file transfer tool and the malicious piece of software on a bunch of devices, but we also still have to circle back to that first device to see if the file transfer tool is there also. And as you keep iterating through this, it goes and it goes and it goes, and you find more IOCs and you find files that are weird and you find paths that, seem strange and threads that you need to investigate. And sometimes they end up being nothing. Sometimes they end up being very critical, right? It could be, well, this person did receive a weird phishing email. Was that part of it? Let's investigate. No, just a regular phishing email, not part of what we're talking about. So the scoping is really, really, really important as part of this identification phase, because this is what allows you to start understanding what is happening. You need to understand where in your environment could be impacted. You need to understand how it's impacted. And ultimately, before you can jump to some of these other stages, the scoping, it won't be complete, but it needs to be fairly thorough. Now, when we go to this cycle, a lot of people are like, well, great, you're scoping stuff. If you found bad stuff, why is there even a containment phase? Why are we not immediately starting to remove stuff from the network? Because instinctually, like, yep, found a bad guy, get the bad guy out, right? Cut the line. But the problem with that is you need to know where the bad guy is all around, or where everywhere the bad guy is, before you start cutting them out. Otherwise, they can go into hiding, or worse, immediately cause damage. Um, if you start looking and you're saying, okay, well, I see Mimikatz on this workstation, I'm just going to delete it right away. Or you see some other type of remote access tool or something else going on, you just, block that, block an IP address that you saw it connecting to. The attacker might realize that you're onto them at this point, and now you don't have any element of surprise, right? If the attacker notices it, they can do a couple of things. One, they can go into hiding on your network. Maybe they already have a persistence hold somewhere else. They just lock into that, shut down what they're doing for a while. That way, your alarm stop going off, and you kind of lose track of them because you didn't really know where they were yet. Alternatively, they can do kind of what happened in the MGM breach, right? MGM got a hold of, or got an idea that they were being attacked. The attacker had already made some requests, but instead of completely scoping, they just started cutting ties with things. They started shutting down their SSO providers. They started shutting down domain controllers, and the attacker did what the attacker did, which is ransomware everything. They did not have control of their network, and they did not have a firm scope of what was going on before they started cutting things out. And the attacker went scorched earth and ransomed everything. Now, I'm not in a position to say if that was the right call or the wrong call or what the outcome would have been otherwise, but that's one of the risks you're dealing with if you're not effectively scoping environments. And I will also say that in the managed services space, which is what this channel is mostly dedicated to, I know I do a lot of cyber content, but really I'm an MSP at heart. This is one of the things that, as I was coming up at the managed services space, we were taught incorrectly about cybersecurity. So I spent a lot of time teaching this section because as I came up as a tech and as an engineer on the system engineer side and on the MSP side, we didn't scope properly. When we ran into issues, we'd identify something and we would immediately try to eradicate. And for us, it was about getting customers back online, and that's how we justified it to ourselves. But very, very regularly, and the stats are out there, right? Like, if somebody gets ransomware and you didn't properly scope and you weren't really able to find that initial cause of access or how they got there, they're probably going to get ransomware again. So you really need to understand that scoping. And I think a lot of MSPs, because they're not trained in traditional incident response typically, because they're more system administrator and they're just edging into the cybersecurity space, they really go from identification to eradication and recovery way too quickly. Um, but it's always a balance. It's really hard to be down as a customer. It's really hard to tell a customer, hey, we know you're offline. We're still investigating while that customer is kind of bleeding revenue, right? So there's always this weird balance. Um, as you get closer to the executive side that is losing money and is focused on keeping the business alive, it's a very relevant position and important position. You'll start seeing people err on the side of, let's move from scope to eradication. We got to get back online. We got to make sure things are safe. If you're in the weeds with most analysts, with most threat intel people, they're on the side of, let's keep digging and make sure we're in the clear before we start taking action. You got to find what's appropriate for your business. But ultimately, the goal of scoping is really to find these four pieces, right? What was the initial access? How did the bad guy get in? What is their persistence method or methods, if they have them? Did they move around laterally? Where? How? Why? And what were the actions they were trying to complete? I can say from experience, one of the scariest things is when you can't figure out what the actions on objectives were. Like, the ego in you is like, yeah, we just caught them fast enough, but really it gets really uneasy when you're in an investigation and you're responding to an incident and you think you found initial access and you think you found persistence, and yeah, they moved laterally, but you can't figure out why they didn't do anything. um, and sometimes you got lucky and they just got caught, right? Like, especially now we're in a world of things like RAS, or ransomware as a service, or access as a service, where an initial compromise or a threat actor might just go for initial access and persistence and then sell that off. Maybe you got lucky and that's what you were in with, right? You ran into somebody who was just trying to breach your environment and they were going to sell that access to somebody else. So there were no actions on objectives. Maybe you just didn't have detection capability and investigation capability thorough enough to figure out what they did, and that's nightmare stuff, right? Like, you're like, okay, I think we got them, and you want to cut them off, and you hope you cut them off, but there's always this uneasy feeling if you can't fill out these four pieces. But that's what identification is all about. Identification is the step where we're scoping problems. We're really trying to understand what these four pieces of the puzzle were. And we're trying to do that before we jump into containment and before we jump into eradication. So that's today's video. The next video will be about containment. I look forward to chatting with you then. Have a great day, and happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thanks.